Example 11, this is the last. The water supply for a city is pumped to a distribution reservoir. The pumping rate is 600 cubic meters per 4 hours. The estimated water requirements every 4 hours are shown on the table. What is the required reservoir capacity? What is the maximum requirement from the reservoir? At 8 a.m., the reservoir contains 700 cubic meters. How much water is in the reservoir at 8 p.m.? So let's tabulate the calculations. We have the time, then the demand. Take note that the pumping rate is 600 cubic meters per 4 hours. So if the demand is 200, then there will be no reservoir requirement required because the pumping alone could serve the demand more enough. So this is the reservoir requirement. So at 4 p.m., since the pumping rate is 600 cubic meters, the demand is only 200, so there's no requirement from the reservoir. The reservoir is at ease. Then at 8 a.m., the pumping rate is only 600, so there's reservoir requirement, which is the difference between the demand and the pumping rate. 800 minus 600, so 200 cubic meters reservoir requirement. At 12 noon, another reservoir requirement, 1,100 minus pumping rate 600, so 500 cubic meters are required from the reservoir. Then at 4 p.m., 700 minus 600 is 100. Then 8 p.m., 12 midnight, no more reservoir requirement because the pumping rate alone can sustain this demand. More than enough. So 0 and 0. So therefore, the question, what is the required reservoir capacity? The reservoir capacity is the sum of this reservoir requirement, 200 plus 500 plus 100. So the reservoir capacity is equal to 800 cubic meters. So that's the reservoir requirement. Then what is the maximum requirement from the reservoir? From this tabulation, it is 500 cubic meters, the maximum reservoir requirement. Then to answer this last question, the reservoir contains 700 cubic meters. So let's have another table. At 8 a.m., the reservoir content is 700. Between 8 to 12 noon, since there's a reservoir requirement of 500, so 700, this 500 must be taken from the reservoir. So 700 minus 500 equals 200 cubic meters left at 12 noon. Then 12 noon to 4 p.m., another reservoir requirement of 100. So 200 minus 100 will be equal to 100 cubic meters. Then between 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., since there's no more reservoir requirement, but the demand is 500, the pumping rate is 600, so the excess of the pumping rate, which is 600 minus 500, which is 100, will be delivered to the reservoir. So 100 plus excess 100 from the pumping rate, so the reservoir must have 200 cubic meters in its content because the source of the reservoir is also coming from the pumping rate during low demand, especially at night. So the reservoir has no other source except this excess pumping rate during low demand. So that's why the reservoir content is 200 cubic meters at 8 p.m. So that's it. So if the question is how much water is in the reservoir at 12 midnight? So the answer is 200 plus 200 plus 300, so 500. Expect 500 cubic meters at 12 midnight. Because the demand is only 300, then there is an excess of 300, 600 minus 300, 300 cubic meters should be stored in the reservoir. So if the question was at 12 midnight, then the reservoir content would be 500. But this is the question, so that's the answer.